Hello again. Here's a book that I profited greatly from, Terence, Qualter, Propaganda and Psychological Warfare. This book I read in preparation for some TV work we did back in the 1990s and early 2000s, where we were being asked about the way that cults entrap people. And not only did I read this book by Qualter, but of course Jacques Ellul's classic on propaganda, and there's a link to that at the end. We've already talked about that, but this book I have used minimally, even though it's a very valuable book. Terence Qualter is a social scientist from Canada, born in New Zealand, published this book in 1962, which derives from his doctoral thesis. So he's an expert in the field of propaganda, and I couldn't help but think as I read it originally and then looked at it again for this video, that is it a coincidence that the rise of propaganda as a science, so-called, in the Western world and in the non-Western world, i.e. in the seats of totalitarianism in Soviet Russia and elsewhere, the rise of propaganda was parallel to the rise of the nation state and the rise of mass education and the rise of the cults, that is from 1840 onward. So here, although Qualter makes the case that propaganda has always existed, but the science of propaganda, the art of propaganda would probably be better, really only got its rise in the sense that we know propaganda today, along with the rise of advertising around the First World War. So he starts his discussion of the First World War's impact upon the growth of propaganda as an art. He says, while politicians were beginning to use propaganda and political scientists were beginning to study its machinery, there was little popular recognition of propaganda until the First World War. In addition to those special characteristics of 19th century society which had led to the emergence of propaganda, the ideological character of the 1914 to 18 war and the unprecedented nature of its operations played a further important part in stimulating greater interest in and awareness of propaganda. The effectiveness of Allied propaganda in hastening the collapse of German morale, or at least a general belief in its effectiveness, ensured that the propagandists would assist in the planning of every major military and political struggle from then on. The study of propaganda activities from 1914 to 1918 is also important in that it demonstrates the enormously wide range of activities regarded by propagandists as coming within the legitimate scope of their interest. Although most popular writing today regards propaganda essentially as a matter of lies and false claims, the men who were actually engaged in propaganda emphasized again and again that while they frequently sought to deceive both the enemy and the people on their own side, whenever possible they told the truth, because the truth made more effective propaganda. And this is where it gets interesting for those of us who've come out of cults, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. We scratch our heads over and over again in frustration because we can't figure out why the propaganda of the cults, specifically the Watchtower, works. Why does it deceive millions of people when the truth is right there for them? Well, he deals with that more expressly in this next section, where he goes to the Cold War, which at that point, 1962, when this book was published, was still very much with us. In fact, that's the year I remember, 12 years old, sweating in my bed in the heat of a Toronto July or August. It was the month that the Cold War reached its hottest stage, in that Kennedy and Khrushchev were facing each other down about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cold War showed the virtue, the problem with propaganda in a new way that even the world wars hadn't. So Qualter goes on this way. When the propaganda tactics of each side in the Cold War are compared, it is soon found that neither side has any inherent natural advantages. The different political systems mean that the East can adopt tactics simply not feasible in a democracy. But although this is true, it is also true that the West is free from the restraints of rigid dogmatism and undue centralism. But apart from these differences in approach, the techniques of propaganda available to the modern dictator are not greatly different from those currently in use in the democracies. When one considers the total of all official and private sources of propaganda, it can soon be seen that the volume of propaganda appeals in a democracy is almost certainly greater than in a dictatorship of comparable size. Yet, although he is not uniquely skilled in the arts of propaganda, the dictator appears able to mold the public mind to his will, to twist public opinion in any direction he wishes. The reason for this greater influence is, of course, the ability of the dictator to create a closed environment from which all ideas contrary to those of the official propagandist are excluded. The weapon of the dictator is not so much propaganda as censorship. The propaganda menace lies not in the volume or methods of propaganda, but in a monopoly control over the means of communication to the exclusion of all propaganda hostile to the established order. Propaganda is a firmly established force in the political life of every modern state. Contrary to popular belief, it need not be a menace to the working of a system of representative democracy. For it is not propaganda that threatens the independence of the individual mind and creates a conditioned mass, but a monopoly, control over the means of propaganda in the conditions of a closed society. It is the absence of the stimulus of conflicting ideas and of any alternative policies that result in the unquestioning uniformity of public opinion in the modern dictatorship. Protection of democracy, therefore, lies not in attempt to restrict or control the activities of propagandists, but in providing the means for the propagation of all points of view. And that last paragraph gives us a solution to the problem of why the cults flourish in the democratic West. Well, cutting off of information, which, as Qualter plainly says here, is the secret to the success of a dictatorship. Censorship, really, another form of propaganda, of course, in a closed society. So that explains both the cults, that is why Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons succeed, because they effectively shut down opposition and other points of view. And it's something we have to think about right now in 2020, because something similar to what happens in those dictatorships is happening all over again in the threat to free speech in the Western world. So I'll put a link into Jacques Ellul, Propaganda, the video we shot on that, and also to the discussion of the use of psychology and propaganda in destructive religious groups. That's another video on your screen.